phone calls, then get some help from an experienced colleague. Rehearse what you're going to say. Make sure it's short, it's clear. I normally start with, I'm really sorry to disturb you on a Friday evening, but I just want to give you some quick feedback on how your child's been doing this week. And I've got to say, it's been a fantastic week. They've done some amazing peer assessment. They've helped me out tidying up equipment and cleaning equipment, and the standard of their coursework was quite remarkable. They have spent the whole week going over and above, and I don't want to keep you any longer. Have a great weekend, and thanks for taking the call. Bye-bye. And I normally use that script to keep the conversation down to about a minute or so. So it's quick and it's efficient. So you might want to practice a little script yourself and run it through. You might want to practice on a colleague. Clearly check with the school, check with your line manager. If you're a student teacher, if you're a newly qualified teacher, check with your mentor and make sure that the school policy fits with what we're talking about. If it doesn't, you might want to start asking some questions about, well, who phones home and how can I get to the point where I can phone home. I would not ever suggest phoning home if your school policy doesn't allow you to do that. So don't go outside of the policy. It's really critical that you use your policy, and you're consistent in applying it. But I think, that nervousness, I meet teachers who have been teaching for 20 years who have never made a phone call home. And that first one is always a bit awkward and it's a bit nerve-wracking and it feels a bit clunky and odd. But I've never met anyone who's done a positive phone call and put the phone down and felt anything other than real joy about it. The odd thing about a positive phone call is it doesn't just make the weekend for the family you're calling, it also is a great ending for your week as well. And particularly when we get to the end of a long term, you're tired, we're searching for the positives. To have a really positive end to the week where you make that call is fantastic. So get practiced, script it out, ask colleagues for support and check. And I often, if I'm going to phone at home for a learner, I will just do a quick check with the head of year or with the form tutor, just to check that me phoning home is not going to cut across any other work that's being done in the school at that time for that learner.
Great, thanks Paul. I'm really sorry everybody, we seem to have a bit of a problem with the audio there at the beginning. So I think you may have missed slightly the first question being asked, and I'm just putting it up on the screen again now so you know what Paul was answering.
Great.
Thank you, Dean, for the question. I'm sorry about the couple of minutes at the beginning there. Right, Paul, I think we're going to move on to the second question now. I have to change rooms after most lessons, which makes it harder to define my space and routines. Any ideas how to make this easier? That's from Jackie.
So if you've got your own teaching room, putting routines up on the walls and laminating them to desks and sticking them on the door is easy, and you can sort of manipulate those as you go along. I tend to either use a digital solution, so I will remind my learners of the routine by scrolling it through as they're walking in on through the projector. I'll also use musical cues, so I use the same music each time to give that environment, whether, just because I've moved classroom, I'm trying to give them those cues as they walk in. So same music, same routine scrolling through. If you don't like the digital solution, either using a big projector screen or perhaps using one of those photo frames, they're quite cool because you can just stick a USB stick in it and it costs you 10 quid for the frame, and then that can just sit on the desk scrolling through. If you prefer something more analog, then those big folders, those big art folders are excellent because you can just unfold it, stand it on the desk and say, right, you remember me? I know we've changed rooms, but you remember the routine, let's run through it. And actually, if you are changing rooms a lot, it does give you that opportunity to run through the routine before they start the work. And that's a really good discipline for you, for me as a teacher, just to remember that when we change room, when we're in a different environment, perhaps a different seating plan, perhaps we're in an open space or we've moved outside, as you call the group to order, I think that's a perfect opportunity just to run through that routine. Okay, can we remember, we're about to get into groups, we're about to do some really intensive debating work. can you remind me of what the routine for that is, and just get them to recall it and repeat it back to you. You could, of course, if you have the time, get them to write it out as soon as they walk in the room, and use that then for the space. So lots of different ways. Either you're doing it digitally, you're doing it analog with the big art folder, or you're passing the responsibility over to your learners to recall and remember. And that's a really good way to start any activity, to give the reminder of the routine. And I think, as we saw through this course, teachers who try to establish routines by using negative reinforcement, so rather than telling the children what the routine is, they just wait for children to slip up. It takes so much longer for the children to learn your expectations, and it's far simpler to preload what you do with the routine first.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. Okay, let's move on to the next question. When should I give rewards, and how do I keep those badly behaved students on track without making rewards unfair? It's interesting, isn't it? It's an interesting question. How do you keep those people who often get the rewards on track?
Yeah, okay, so for me, I'm going to reframe that whole thing. Rewards tempts us down the sort of material rewards line, money, stuff, presents. I prefer the recognition. Again, we've got to establish that baseline of, you get positive recognition for going over and above, you get acknowledgement for doing the right thing, you get a thank you for turning up on time, you get praise for opening the door for everyone as they're walking through. So we'll establish that line. That's important. Can you put the question back up again? Because it's in a few parts, that one. Clearly, some learners have learnt to play a game with positive recognition. They've learnt that if they mess about for 4 lessons and then suddenly turn it on for 1, they get showered with positive recognition, and in some schools with reward. I think you need to give them, if we go look at the positive note, I know lots of people have had a lot of success recently with the positive note. My positive note for those learners is cut into 4 or 5 sections. And when that learner has a great day, a great lesson, and goes over and above, they can have a portion of that positive note. And it might take them 5 weeks to earn the note, but they are getting that little bit of encouragement, that little bit of, they're on the track to get their positive note. And it would be fair for a learner who worked for 5 days solid and went over and above to get their positive note at the end of the week. It would also be fair for a learner who struggles and one day they're up and the next day they're down to receive that positive note after 4 weeks. So I think the recognition system you use is, it's critical that it's simple to use and easy to apply, but you've got to make sure that you don't over-reward and buy into that game that learners have played. Essentially, we're going to stop game playing and moving away from sort of points reward systems and you get 10 points and you get 5 and you get 3. Once we've moved away from that madness, we can, through praise, positive notes and positive phone calls, we can make it a lot fairer because it's a lot simpler. I also think that some learners need to be starved of their addiction to reward and recognition. Now, if you imagine if you've been in school for 7 years and every time you do something even remotely positive, you're showered with positive recognition and rewards, you will start to expect that. Now, you and I both know that in the world of work and in the world of higher education, that does not happen. Simply because you do something good, there's not someone standing on your shoulder ready to give you great praise and reward. So for some of our learners, we're having to wean them off that. For some of our learners, we're going to have to go cold turkey and actually reduce the amount of attention you give them for poor behaviour and start to gently increase the focus on positive recognition. And that's something that takes time. What you've done on this course will start you off on that process, but actually getting to the point where you're re-engaging those learners could be weeks, could be a couple of months before you've really turned them back to the fact that a little bit of positive recognition and a little bit of praise is all they're going to get. They're not going to get showered with rewards simply because on a Friday afternoon they decide to turn it on. And as you make that transition, or rather as you shift the expectation for your learners, you can expect there to be a few wobbles and for it to feel a bit odd for them that they're not getting the attention from poor behaviour, but you're preparing them for the real world. And in the real world, you get positive recognition, but it's not every minute of every day. And so it's important that they get that positive recognition spaced out over time rather than all in one big chunk.
Sorry.
So there's car alarm going off.
There's a car alarm going off, and
it's
I
okay.
wanted to check it wasn't.
It's a nice urban soundtrack for the pivotal for the webinar.
We definitely can't close the window. It's
there will be no closing of windows because we will both die in the heat.
Right, let's move to question 4, Paul.
Brilliant.
Do you have experience of times when positive notes home were too frequent and therefore the impact has been diminished and devalued?
All the time, and I keep saying to people that if you want to sustain and maintain the value of the reward, of the recognition that you're giving to the learner, you cannot give out positive notes like confetti. I've seen it. I had somebody who came to a course who immediately bought some positive notes from us and then went out and just went mad with them and started giving them to all the learners and ran out in 2 weeks. So he bought a big box of positive notes and had given them all out, and it had taken 2 weeks. And then he called me and said, well, I need some more positive notes. And I said, well, I thought you bought enough for maybe a year or 2 years maybe. And actually what happened was that the initial sort of boost that it gave his learners didn't sustain because actually he wasn't building up any desire for these positive notes. They were too easy to get. They were too easy and freely available, and they lost their cachet very, very quickly. So look, 2 positive notes per week is enough. And all the schools we work with, they do exactly that. They give praise for over and above. They give positive notes for positive recognition, 2 per week, and they make 1 phone call every week. And those schools and those classrooms are transforming just with that really high quality relational recognition that cuts deep into family life and shows the pride of the parent, the pride of the teacher, and indeed the pride of the child. I would say on positive notes is that you will have some children, some learners who don't necessarily live with their parents or are in slightly different situations. In those circumstances, the positive note must be given to somebody who looms large in the child's life. It could be a tutor, it could be a mentor, it could be someone from school, but there will be someone in the child's life when they're proud, the child feels that boost and that motivation you get from sharing great news with people who really matter and who you really trust.
Great, thank you, Paul. Okay, let's move on to question 5. Isn't a digital postcard home or note on Edmodo, for example, or similar, just as good, if not better, than a paper note home? This was a comment in one of the discussion forums.
Okay, my straight answer is no. It's not better, and I'll tell you why. Look, there's nothing wrong with using digital systems. I'm not here to criticise digital systems, but the paper system, the analogue for the positive note, it is more transferable. It's more likely to be displayed in the home, whereas a digital certificate is less likely to. It's more likely to be put in a scrapbook at home, shared with granny, grandpapa. It's also when you give that note to the child, to the learner, and you look them in the eye and you tell them why they're getting this high level of positive recognition, and then they feel the note in their fingers, there's a tactile memory to it. Look, text messages are great. Emails are fine. Certificates off Edmodo. If that's what your school do, then you've gone 80% of the way to doing something fantastic. But I think the paper thing wins. The trouble with an email the trouble with something digital is it gets filed very, very quickly and it doesn't live after the event. A positive note will live on the fridge for a month, 2 months, 3 months maybe, and then it will live in the scrapbook, and it will come back again when the learner's doing their end of course achievement record. I had a student who was 18 years old who gave me her record of achievement at 18 after A-levels, and it was that thick, absolutely wedge thick. And I said, what have you put in here? You need to get some of this stuff out. And actually what she'd done is she'd put in every single positive note she'd ever been given. And she'd take that file to interview for higher education and for jobs, and she would beat candidates with better marks because she had the real evidence of that, of that achievement from all sorts of different adults who had given her these positive notes through school. And I think when we get to that point, you can see why the digital solution, although it's very neat, although it's very clean, I think it loses something in the transition between the teacher, the learner, and home.
Great, thanks, Paul. And it is very interesting though, because I think lots of teachers do say that they think that the immediacy of the parent getting the notification on their phone is what's important with the digital rewards. And you can understand how that how you'd feel that way, but presumably all of the students that get a positive note are going to take that home and show them.
And I mean, we know as parents and as teachers that sometimes when you get a message in the middle of the day, it can make you feel great, but the child's not there to see the reaction, and you get on with your busy day. The moment that you really want to have that conversation with your child is when you finish work perhaps and they've come home from school, and that moment where they walk in the door and they show you the note. I don't think you can beat that. And I think, of course, we like text messages, but again, is that going to get lost in the busy lives? We work with hundreds of schools, and our positive notes, once we introduce them into the way of working, they never leave. So the evidence is that when people start doing the paper positive notes, they don't then move to the digital. People who start with digital very often don't move to the paper because the analog way seems old-fashioned. I just think there's a place for digital and there's a place for analog, and for me and for the work we do, the positive note is better for the analog. But look, we're splitting hairs, aren't we? Because actually, if you're sending positive messages to the home and that's part of your positive reinforcement strategy, then we're not here to criticize you, and we're talking about something that's slightly better, and you might argue your way is slightly better. The most important thing is you're sending those positive messages home, and you're creating that connection between what happens in the classroom and how the parents, guardians reinforce it at home, and then the positive attitude that the learner then brings back into school on the Monday morning.
Brilliant, thanks. There's a comment that's just come up in the live chat about somebody who said that they put positive notes written in the child's planner. How do you feel about that?
Lovely. Again, we're splitting hairs. If you're doing that and it's working for you, fantastic. I just want to know whether the parent can then rip that note out and put it on the fridge, because I think there is something about displaying it in the home rather than keeping it in the planner. And I'd also encourage you, we talked a lot about positive notes, and of course with a positive note there's often a space on the back, and I really, really like it when teachers, rather than just giving a positive note and saying you've done well, have a positive note, that there's some extra work on the back, so that you say to the learners, you're good at that. And it's a hook, rather than just you've done well, have a note. It's you've got some real potential in my subject, and the way that you structured that investigation, the way that you evaluated it, shows remarkable insight. Take this positive note, and on the back I've put a couple of websites you can look at, and I've also put an invite to the science club that we're having next Wednesday. And I think in that way you start to take the positive note away from the sort of behaviour arena and start to shift it into learning. When you tell a child they're good at something, they might well go home at the weekend and practice it more. And even if 10% of the learners that took a positive note did the extra work, it would have been really worthwhile doing that. But I think what you'll find, as lots of the teachers we work with find, is that a lot more than 10% will go and do the extra work. There's that weird thing that if you tell me I'm good at the guitar, I'll probably go home at the weekend and practice. Not for an exam, not because I'm getting the band back together, not because I want the applause, but just because I suddenly feel successful at something. And to some of our harder to reach learners, it's so critical that we find something that they're actually good at and then show them that they're good at it. If you spend the whole time down the behavioural line, well done, you behaved well, your learners get to 13, 14 years old, and actually they need more than just being told, well done, you've behaved well. In fact, you could argue with me quite rightly that beyond about year 4, year 5, we should be shaping these positive notes to reflect the learning rather than just simply to reflect good behaviour.
Thanks, Paul. I think we've got a comment from somebody later on that's touching on the same sort of subject, so we'll see that in a bit as well. Okay, the next question refers to the Chantel video, which I know you'll remember. In the Chantel video, the teacher speaks to Chantel quietly and then moves away to give her time to comply.
Yeah.
But what happens if the student's rude to the teacher behind their back while they're walking away? How are you going to deal with that?
It's the hardest thing to deal with when you're a newly qualified teacher, particularly because those sorts of incidences where you've done the right thing, you've been calm, you've delivered your script, you've done everything right, you've used the blocking techniques, you've stopped them taking you into a cul-de-sac, and then as you turn your back, you know that something has been said behind your back, or some signal, inappropriate signal has been made behind your back. The temptation is to spin right round and give full barrels to the learner. But you have to question that. Who's in control of this moment? Are you going to pass control back to the learner, in which case you would spin round, point your finger, what did you say to me, I saw that? Or are you going to take the control that you had through delivering the script and walk away with it? So here's the deal. When children make signs behind your back, when they swear behind your back, when they make rude comments and the rest of the class laugh, you need to do a couple of things. The first thing you need to do is you need to turn to the rest of the class and acknowledge that you saw what happened, or you know there's been a problem when you walked away from Stuart. They can see there's a problem. You don't need to worry. You can trust me to follow up later. Because there will be some learners in your class for whom that kind of disrespect towards an adult seeds anxiety. They don't live in homes where that happens. They're not taught in classrooms where that happens often. So you've got to be really careful to acknowledge their anxiety. Once you've been working with the group for 3 months, they will know that when you walk away and someone says something behind your back, that you will always follow up. But for the first 3 months, while you're getting to know a group, I think you need to make that clear. The second thing you need to do is the thing that nobody ever does, and it's the most critical. Some of the most experienced teachers I worked with taught me this very early in my career, and it served me extremely well. They said, when a learner is rude to you behind your back, when you've made when you've acknowledged that with the class so that they know you're not ignoring it, the next thing you need to do is write it down. Not in front of the child, but quietly, away from the incident. Just write down what happened when you walked away. The key then is to get on with the lesson. Catch someone doing the right thing, put them on the recognition board. Odd turn of phrase. Put them on the recognition board, search for the positives, and then I always like to leave a bit of time. I like children to know that I'm going to follow up. But I don't want them to think that I'm always going to follow up immediately. Sometimes I like learners to sleep on what's happened and perhaps think I've forgotten. And I'll be there the next morning. I'll be deliberately standing at the front gate of the school. I'll have it written down what the learner said to me when I walked away. And I'll probably have a colleague with me just to make sure that learner understands fully that they're not just having this discussion with me, but this is about the expectations of all staff within the faculty, all staff within the school. Now look, some of the toughest learners I've ever worked with, once I've gone through that process twice, they stop being rude behind my back. Even the really difficult ones. Most times you have to do that once and suddenly the child thinks, okay, he's one of those. He's going to follow up, he's not going to let it lie, and actually he's written it down, so I need to be a bit careful. And they start to change their behaviour towards you once they know you're one of those teachers who will follow up, not aggressively, not with huge amount of punishment, although you might argue with me that someone being disrespectful to you behind your back as you're walking away, deserves more than just a little talking to. You might well be right, but I think the first thing to do is to sit the learner down. They'll probably, in the cold light of the morning, be apologising madly. Sometimes that'll be tactical, sometimes it'll be honest. And I like to sit them down and say, I want to read to you what I wrote down. I'm going to write it down without judgment, and I'm going to ask them to respond to it. You will see in the next section of the course how that meeting can be really well structured as a restorative meeting, and there are 5 set questions that you can go through. So again, just as the script is structured, your follow-up is structured. What we find with teachers is that they are brilliant at dealing with crisis, often very good at dealing with angry learners, but then they sort of drop it. And there aren't that many teachers who are really, really good at the follow-up, and that's the key. If you're really good at the follow-up, your learners know that you won't let it lie, that there are consequences, that you will be speaking to them, but you won't do it in public, you won't do it and spin round on their demand, you won't show them the disrespectful behaviour they're showing to you, because you will not allow your behaviour to be controlled by your learners. And that's a really important distinction. So although it feels like a slightly odd process, although it might feel a bit difficult at first to walk away, you know where you're going. You've got your signpost, you know exactly why you're doing it, you know how you're going to follow it up, and your learners know you're not ignoring it. That's really, really key.
Great, Paul, thank you. You often refer to those behaviours that happen when people are walking away as secondary behaviours.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't you?
And the secondary behaviour is classic, because the secondary behaviour is designed to poke you where, at the moment you're most vulnerable, at the moment you thought you've solved it. It's almost like the last word. And if you chase secondary behaviours, you will go mad, because some of your trickier learners will throw out secondary behaviours, and they're almost chase me behaviours. So you can have the example where you ask a learner to go and take a couple of minutes to stand outside the door and regroup because they've reached the timeout step on your classroom ladder. They leave the room, but on leaving the room they slam the door, and it's a classic invitation for the teacher. And I mean, you must have seen it working. You must have seen it from other teachers, if not from yourself. As soon as that door is slammed, the teacher's anger rises. They're straight out into the corridor. Why did you slam the door at me? And the child's got them then, because they're not talking about the primary behaviour. The primary behaviour was to leave the room, and they did so. The secondary behaviour was slamming the door, and now the teacher is being caught on the secondary behaviour. And it's always at a much higher emotional level. Now, you and I both know that some of the most tricky children, they're very, very good at the shouty argument. They have no problem with that. You raise your voice to them, they'll raise their voice to you. They do shouting at home, they do shouting outside the school with their friends. They're good shouters. They can deal with a solid, aggressive argument probably much easier than you can, because you're busier. But to resist doing that has its advantages. They suddenly realise they cannot provoke you. After a while, they'll stop doing the secondary behaviours because they realise they get no reaction from it. And if I have a child who I'm talking to, I'm sure you've had this experience, who's sort of throwing their head around and tutting and harumphing, I won't pick up on it in the conversation. I might have to stop the meeting, but I won't start talking about your attitude. I don't like the way you're looking at me. I don't like the way you're smiling at me. But I will write it down again, And then the next day, when everything's calm and they're in that rational brain, I will sit them down just quietly or catch them at lunchtime in the dining hall and say, you know, when I talked to you yesterday and you were throwing yourself around and wanted to leave and we were packing your bag while I was talking to you, next time I talk to you, this is what I expect. And just to redraw that line. Again, resist the temptation to do it in the moment. If you follow up, and you always follow up, they will change their behaviour towards you, but it will not happen overnight. And it's really key on this course to understand that behaviour management, particularly dealing with children who have got ingrained routines that have built up over years, you are not going to unfold them and unpeel them in a week. So that's why we talk about that 30 days to make a change. It's critical that when you decide to make a change, either in your strategy or in your own behaviour, that you sustain it for 30 days so that children know you're actually serious and what you say is going to happen is going to happen. That's how you get your certainty. That's how you get to be one of those teachers that walks down the corridor and learners change their behaviour as you walk, without you even asking, because they know you will always follow up. Even if you don't notice it in the moment, you will follow up, follow up, follow up.
Great, thank you. There's been quite a few comments coming in while you've been speaking on this question, and I just want to chuck a couple of the questions your way, really.
Sure.
How would you acknowledge to the rest of the class? You mentioned that when somebody does a secondary behaviour and you're walking away, the first thing you do is to acknowledge to the rest of the class that you've observed that. Can you give an example of how you might acknowledge?
Okay, depending on the group and depending on the age, I'd probably say something along the lines of, you know that was a difficult moment, I know that was a difficult moment, you need to trust me that I'll speak to Stuart later, or whoever the child was. And I think that's enough, you know, a difficult moment. In that way, you're not judging. If you walk away and say, you know that Stuart swore at me and I know that he swore at me, well, I don't know that he swore at me, because all I know is the reaction that I got. And Stuart is then very likely to go, I didn't swear at you. And then we're off into another discussion about what he didn't want we did. So without judgment. Again, we're using that lovely phrase, I've noticed, which works very well. You might have noticed that was difficult. I felt that was a bit awkward. You can trust me to speak to Stuart privately at the right time. I think, you know, you have your little stock phrases. That's mine. Doesn't mean it would be right for you, but you probably want to work that out because it will happen. And if you've got the right line to deliver it and you can deliver it calmly, what's critical is that the rest of the class see that it has not affected you. This is where your poker face comes in. You cannot show that it has affected you.
It can be part of the script.
Yeah, it's part of that script, and the script comes with, you know, the right tone and the right body language and the poker face that says, no, you're not getting my smile, my humour, my enthusiasm, but neither are you getting my anger. What we're trying to do here is you know, great behaviour management is not at the ends of the spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you've got the shouters, the aggression, the hostility. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got nice cups of tea and, oh, don't worry, dear, never mind. We're trying to get, you know, behaviour management is in the middle here. It's tough enough to be strict but not nasty. It's kind enough to be compassionate and empathetic but not sympathetic. And I think that's the bit we're trying to get to. And nobody gets to that instantly. It takes time to develop those skills and to sort of bring in the edges of your range. If you think about a really good actor, or indeed a really good parent, they will very, very rarely, if ever, show the complete edge of their range. You know, a great actor will never scream, shout to the full extent of their voice, because actually they're much more interesting when you don't see the edges of their range. Some of your learners will want to see you lose your rag completely so they know what that looks like and they know how far they can take you. If you keep it in this middle range, then you don't allow them to see the bits of your, bits of your emotion that you keep for yourself. You keep for your private life. You keep for home. You keep for when you walk into the staff room or you walk into the faculty office. They don't need to see those bits. And as much as possible, we're trying to work in that middle range.
Great. Somebody else has also asked. You've talked about follow-up.
Yeah.
And about how follow-up is so key.
Yeah.
Can you give suggestions as to the different ways that people can follow up? So you've mentioned waiting at the door
waiting at the
school,
front of the school,
finding them in in lunchtime and things. Is it more effective if you do that outside the classroom when they're not expecting it? Or is it, just okay to wait till the beginning of the next lesson? What do you think?
So as a young teacher, and as a teacher who was really struggling with behaviour management for the first year and a half, and I did really, really struggle, I used to wait till they went into a lesson where I knew that the teacher that was in that lesson was really strong and really good at managing behaviour. And I would then, in my free period, or in 5 minutes that I could get free, knock on the door and say, would you mind if I borrowed? And what's really interesting is they're then in a different environment, in a slightly different culture in their lesson. That teacher then sort of looks at them to think, oh, okay, right. And you're almost triangulating support because, that teacher is strong, the learner's in that lesson, you're coming to pick them up. There's almost a triangle going on there that says, if you're... what behaviour you do in that lesson should also be the behaviour you show towards this teacher. And I had some very good conversations just standing outside in the corridor of that lesson. That's a nice one. The other nice one is to pick them up at the end of the day, again from a lesson where they're not going to be able to run off from. I pick learners up at lunchtime. I like the unexpected bit. I like the fact they don't know when it's going to happen, and they're not ready for it. They're not sort of prepared.
And would you always do it in a face-to-face way, or is there any mileage in writing them a note or doing it in any other kind of medium?
No, I think it'll be face-to-face. And I think what's key here is that as a newly qualified teacher, or as a new teacher in a school, this is the moment where you might need support, and visible support. So if you're not confident about going to pick up that learner perhaps in the dining hall, then it's a great moment to grab a senior teacher, to grab an experienced colleague and say, would you just come and stand next to me while I have this conversation? Or indeed, could you show me how you would talk to that learner? So you're learning from them, and the learner's seeing that you are a consistent I really like the early morning. I'll tell you why, particularly for older teenagers, is they're barely awake. And if the first thing they get when they walk into school is to have to face what happened yesterday, then two things are good. One is you catch them on the hoof. The second thing is you clear up all the problems from yesterday before school starts that day. And so when they walk into your lesson, they're not walking in with that sort of aggression towards you, or that sort of anxiety of, are you going to have a go at me now? Or we haven't resolved what happened yesterday, and that sort of slightly odd feeling. So we need very often to clear it up at the beginning of the day. And you and I both know that once the day starts, very often it's so 100 miles an hour that you can easily forget to pick them up from a lesson or see them at lunchtime. So that routine of, I'm going to be at the gate in the morning, is great. And of course, being at the gate in the morning has its advantages as well, particularly if you're a new teacher, because the learners get to see you standing next to senior staff. They get the idea that you're part of this whole community. You don't just deal with behaviour in your classroom. They get used to seeing you, that you get to make them feel welcome and make them feel important. And actually, in a way, if you spend a lot of your time out on duty, you start to build your capital within the whole school. And again, and it's over time of doing that, you suddenly become one of those members of staff who learners are used to speaking to around the site, and they're used to taking behavioural advice from. And so when you have to deal with a difficult situation in the corridor, you'll be able to do that much, much easier.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical, actually. And really, it almost goes against what you feel as a new teacher who feels out of control. I mean, what you really want to do, and your natural instincts are to hide yourself away, to not put yourself in front of anyone,
get involved,
to spend as much time as you can by yourself, and to move away from the learners as far as possible.
I've got to say, I learned more from being on the gate, walking around, dealing with learners that I hadn't met. I learned more skills doing that than I may have done in the classroom, because I was surrounded by real experts, the older teachers, the more senior teachers, who were doing that sort of work all the time. And I learned so much from them about how to intervene, what to say, when to walk away, which battles to choose. And so I know that the temptation is, right, it's break time in the staff room, coffee, general stimulation, food, cakes, whatever it might be. But just taking a walk around, or having your lunch with the learners, and being a visible presence in the school has huge advantages. I'm also if you find yourself in a position where you're applying for an internal position within the school and you're one of those people who are visibly present around the site, to my mind, that would be a very positive mark on your record when going for an interview for a more senior post.
Yeah.
If you're one of those people that hide in the staff room, run away at the end of the day at 3:30, turn up just before the bell, you're going to struggle to persuade the head that they should be giving you a broader responsibility across the school.
Yes, that's really interesting and a good point, Paul. Okay, let's move on to the next one, because we've had quite a lot of chat about that question. It's
Good. Good.
It provoked a lot of discussion.
Great.
Okay, so the next question is also stems from scripted intervention. How do you use scripted interventions while still differentiating for the needs of different students? Can you really have a one script fits all approach?
Oh, okay. Can you really have a one script fits all approach? Okay. My natural answer to that years ago would be no, everything needs to be personal, everything needs to be tailored. But the work we're doing in Caerphilly, the work we do across schools in London, the work we're doing in every school we're working in shows clearly that you can replicate that practice, and that scripted interventions work. We use scripted interventions in pupil referral units, in beautiful primary schools, in some of the best prep schools in the country, and some of the top public schools and international schools. These are learners from a huge variety of different situations. And I think the differentiation comes where you recognise when is the right time to use a script and when it's not. So I'll give you an example. A learner comes in, and every other lesson they've been absolutely fine. And on this one day, they're really awkward, they're quite anxious, they're quite angry, but yet it's a one-off incident. I wouldn't start wading in with scripts and steps and sanctions and all the rest of it. I'd take the learner aside and say, there's clearly something and I'd give them the time and space. But if I've got Robert who comes in every lesson, looks grumpy, keeps his coat on, doesn't want to do any work, wanders around the room issuing threats, I am going to give him the scripted approach, whether he is ADHD, whether he has got issues at home, whether he's got... regardless of what's going on, there are boundaries in the classroom that learners should and can adhere to. I'll give you a really good example of that. A lady I know is called Karen Ardley. She works in the hotspots, in the trouble spots across the world, and she's brilliant. And she told me about schools in Israel and schools on the Gaza Strip. This is not a political point. It's about children walking into school from war zones on both sides of that divide. And there are 256 schools on the Gaza Strip, and every one of those children, and the children in Israel, they come into school, they've got personal experience of war, of death, of tragedy, and every single one of those children in the classroom, you could argue, is suffering their own emotional trauma. And what the teachers say is they hang a carrier bag on the door and they say, can you put your problems in the bag? This is learning time. Now, that might seem a bit harsh. I'm not expecting you to do that. But what that message gives is, this is learning time. I am going to be there for you at break time. There's pastoral teams at lunchtime. You've got student support services. There are many people you can talk to. But this moment here is for learning. And in that way, I'm going to try and shift the personal issues, shift the emotional issues to another time and another place, and just give that 30-second intervention. If the 30-second intervention was harsh and nasty, I discourage anyone from using that with learners. But actually, the script is kind. It is presupposing good behaviour. It's drawing clear boundaries, and it's not nasty. And I've used that script. And the script that I demonstrated to you in the course is the script I use with my own children. It's a script I've used with every learner I've ever worked with. It's a script I use anywhere from a mainstream school to a pupil referral unit to dealing with learners in custodial settings. It's the same script. What's important here is not necessarily the words, although you can argue there are better words than others. It's your consistent approach at doing that. It's your poker face, your tone, your body language, your signals to the child that their behaviour is not acceptable and they have crossed the line. But you don't need to do that with anger and with shouting. So, it's interesting. You would differentiate for learning, and of course we would differentiate for behaviour as well. But I think once the child has had a reminder and a warning, there's no problem about delivering the script as a last chance. And I very, very rarely meet children who aren't in control of their behaviour at all. In some very severe cases, you have children who can't make good behavioural choices. Most of the learners that you work with, in fact, probably all of the learners you work with, are capable of making that choice, and you will go through the script with them to show to everybody in the class that it is fair and equitable. One of the tricks I use is that when I start introducing the script, I don't use it with those learners first. What I do is I catch one of my seemingly always well-behaved, well-mannered learners, I catch them doing something and I demonstrate the script by using it on some of the normally well-behaved learners, so that the children who are going to receive that script don't feel it's just for them, or they're being picked on, or you don't use that script with anyone else, you're just using it with me. So how you introduce it is important. The final thing on that is when you start introducing scripts, when you start introducing changes, don't start introducing them first with your most difficult class. You've probably got some younger year groups, you've probably got a lovely year 7 group or a lovely year 8 group who are absolutely perfect. Start using the structures, the techniques with them first. Get used to it, get rehearsed, get so that you're not having to fluff your lines so that you know exactly where you're going and how you're going to leave, and then transfer that expertise to the more difficult learners once you are prepared. You have to understand that many of the learners you're working with, they have spent the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years batting away adults who are trying to get them to follow instructions. You are not going to be batted away, and you're going to need to show real persistence in this script in order for it to sink in and work. Don't expect a scripted approach to work before the end of a 30-day period. After the 30 days, it's embedded, it's expected, and what you'll find is, as you crouch down next to the learners and start the script, they'll go, "It's okay, sir, I'll see you at break time today." They don't even need the script. Actually, the dropping down, it becomes a cue in itself, and learners start to know where they are on the steps. But you have to expect in the first 30 days that they will run through those steps. They'll try and take you all the way. They have to know that you're serious and you will go through with what you say.
It's interesting, isn't it? While you were talking, I was thinking that really it's about training the students in appropriate responses. And by having a consistent teacher message, you are encouraging the student to have a consistent response, and you're training them into how you expect them to behave. Absolutely.
And if you've got teaching assistants, learning support assistants, lab technicians, if you've got any other adults working in and around your teaching space, they need to know the script as well, because it should not be just the teacher that uses the script. Very often, the script is most empowering for those members of staff who have never really been taught how to deal with those really knotty situations. So, of course there's differentiation in there, but I think that's differentiation about recognising, the sort of the exceptions to the rule, the learners who come in one day and you just immediately recognise they're not themselves and their behaviour they're exhibiting is not through frustration with work or with you or with the school. There's something else going on. That's your point of differentiation for me.
Great, thank you, Paul. Right, let's move on. The next question is about, how can you undertake an intervention, so we're still on interventions, with one student quietly at the side of the room, as some of the videos are showing us, like the video with Michael, if the rest of the class are going a bit mental, if they're running riot, and you can't have that quiet.
No, you can't. No, you can't. So you're going to have to delay it. If the class are running riot, I think, for me, I'd be calling for some support if you can't bring that to order again. I think there's some positives here, though. Going through the script with a learner in front of other learners is no problem, because the other learners see that's the process you're going through and it's consistent whoever you're talking to. But I don't think, if the class is running riot, your priority is to bring the class to order. And taking a learner to the side while the rest of the class is out of control, it is not going to serve you or the needs of that child or the needs of the class. So I think, you know, in that specific situation that you've highlighted, I'd be calling for support. I'd ask the teacher who's arriving to take my class for a minute while I spoke to the learner outside, and I'd make sure that we don't have that chaos going on while I'm trying to deliver more private messages, because it's not going to go well. I might have to wait and speak to that learner tomorrow when I can find them in a quiet space, or indeed as they're walking into the school.
Okay, brilliant, thanks. So it's really about follow-up if you can't do it then and there.
Yeah, you must follow up, and that's the key, because they'll think they've got away with it. They think they're not having to answer for their behaviour, but you're going to pick them up later and say, I couldn't speak to you then because it was a difficult situation, but I'm really happy just to sit down with you now for a couple of minutes, and I need us to go through this and to reset what, you know, the expectations for the next lesson.
Okay, great. There's just a couple of comments that people have put into the discussion forums, which I think are really interesting, and kind of highlight some of the things that we're talking about, particularly about positive recognition, as working really well and really immediately in their classes.
Good.
So I just wanted to share a couple of comments with you, and then maybe you can, you know, let us know what you think. So this is from Janie. She says, students loved the notes. So she's talking about positive notes home.
Great.
Now they all want one.
Good.
Parents shocked but pleased to receive positive feedback. The parent I spoke to had 2 children with them, so at the school. One is consistently good, that's her student, and the older brother, her student who's the older brother, and one is regularly bad. The mother was so pleased because she was used to getting calls about the younger son's bad behaviour, but had never had a positive call. She'd been happy enough not to hear anything directly about her older son because she'd taken the no news is good news attitude. But now she'd had that confirmed, and she was very grateful. So it's really nice, isn't it?
It's so lovely, and I get tweets and emails and messages all the time about the positive notes. And when I see schools who ignore the positive note, or who go and spend vast amounts of money on some new system in order to replicate what the positive note does, it's exasperating. So it's lovely to hear the good news, and I know how that, you know, it makes me feel great, and I know how great the learner will feel, and also how good you're feeling now that you've found the strategy that really connects what you're doing with home. Brilliant.
Great. And another comment. So this is from Stella. She says, I did several activities that included an optional follow-up. For example, students writing a poem, and then had the option of taking it home and making a well-presented copy with illustrations.
Right.
The ones who completed the optional extra were given postcards home. It increased motivation, and the students were really taking care of their work and taking the time at home to make improvements. They were proud of their postcards, but more importantly, of the work they produced.
Lovely.
I think what Stella's talking about here is really what you talk about sometimes, which is about going over and above and rewarding students for going over and above what the minimum, what your expectations are.
And I think, you know, as a school, that should be your mantra, over and above. As a class teacher, that should be your mantra. As a learning support assistant, you'll get positive recognition from me when you go over and above. And you know what? When we work with parents, that's really key to them managing behaviour of their children at home, is that they establish that over and above rule at home. I know with our children, that if we don't emphasise that, then they tend to become a little bit sort of ungrateful, or just accepting things that they're going to get things without working for them. So we're constantly on that over and above mantra. It's really important, and it's a small tweak that makes a massive difference, just like the positive notes, just like the positive phone calls.
Brilliant. Now, Paul, we've got 5 minutes or 4 minutes left, really.
Crikey.
And
Where did the time go?
I know.
I've no idea.
I just wondered if you could maybe give, because there isn't a webinar next week, and there is one more week of the course. And it's focusing on restorative practices.
Okay.
And I wondered if you could give people just a little taster of what they can expect next week, and what the key messages might be.
So in the next section, the restorative meeting section, you're going to be shown 5 key questions that, again, are repeated on each restorative conversation. Now, a restorative conversation does not mean you throw your sanctions out of the window. Most of the time, we encourage people to think about using restorative conversations as an option for the child. So the child reaches a high tariff, there's a sanction that's imposed, maybe it's a half an hour detention or a school detention. And the deal I always make, and the way that we start to introduce these restorative meetings, is to say to the learner, look, you are serving a detention on Wednesday, but if you come and see me on Tuesday lunchtime and we can do this meeting, I'll give you the questions so that you can prepare to come to that meeting. And if we can have that meeting done well, then there's no need for you to do that restorative conversation. There's no need for you to do the punishment element of it on Wednesday. I think people who have not been through that restorative process might feel a little bit anxious that it's not going to get the same outcomes as maybe the firm detention with the deputy head will. But you know what? Restorative conversations mean you're not passing problems up the chain, that you're taking responsibility, that you look the learner in the eye, that you build rapport and trust, and they know you're the one that's going to follow up, not the deputy head, not somebody higher up the chain. You're going to take personal responsibility for it. So key issues. Restorative conversations need to take place very often in public places. You don't want to start locking yourself into classrooms, and in a public place, in the library, in the dining halls, is perfectly all right. If you need to be supported in doing that restorative conversation, then ask another member of staff and give them the 5 questions. If the learner needs to be supported, and in certain situations they will be, particularly if you're working in special schools, particularly if you're working with learners who are more vulnerable or perhaps not quite as verbal, then they might need support from a teaching assistant, from a friend, from another teacher. And I think we go through that process, and that restorative process, it serves a number of purposes. One, it's reflective, so we're talking about what happened, what they've thought, what's going to happen next. Secondly, it encourages dialogue and allows them to start to learn how to answer for their behaviour rather than just sort of swearing or running out or acting in temper. And finally, it shows to every single member of staff that you are not just going to follow the same route of crime and punishment, throw them in detention. You know, it's a nonsense that detention is going to solve your problems. Detention is a soggy, wet last resort. If you saw last week, page 15 of the Times last Tuesday, I wrote a section of, I was interviewed for the Times and saying exactly that. This obsession with detention has to cease. We need to build relationships between teachers and learners. We need to hold boundaries. Of course we do. We need to make sure that we are strict. But to me, if you're sticking children in detention next Thursday with somebody else, it goes beyond an appropriate consequence, and it becomes some kind of punitive sanction. And punitive sanctions build resentment with learners. Restorative conversations build rapport, build relationships, and build trust.
Brilliant, Paul. Thank you very much. That's a really nice way of finishing the webinar, I think. I just want to apologise again for the incessant and relentless burglar alarm that was disturbing us through the session, and hope that you still managed to hear Paul all right. So I just want to finish by saying goodbye. I'm Ellie Dix. You probably missed that at the beginning, and you're probably wondering who I am and why I'm here. And from myself and from Paul, thank you very much for coming, and we hope you enjoyed the rest of the course.
Thank you very much, and don't forget Pivotal Podcast, and have a look at episode 76 this week, Behaviour, Psychology and Dealing with Troublesome Learners, with a special guest, Tim O'Brien. So do have a look at the podcast, because it fits beautifully with what we've been talking about on the course. And the best of luck to you all. Do make sure you connect with us through Twitter, through email, and through all the other resources on our website. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.